Louisiana, the French heritage of the state is well known, and French language and culture have left an imprint on the modern day culture of Louisiana as well. And there's numerous surnames of French origin that can be found throughout the state. However, some of these surnames that are perceived to be of French origin are actually of Spanish origin and underwent Gallicization during and after the end of the colonial period. And as an example, two surnames are Rodrigue and Domingue. And if you know Spanish or are familiar with Spanish, you can see, okay, Rodriguez and Rodrigue and Domingue and Dominguez are obviously related. And actually, when I moved to Louisiana about 20 years ago, it's like, why did they misspell those names? But actually, those are correct due to Gallicization. There we go. Yeah, okay, so this process of Gallicization was variable, and it affected some surnames, but not others. And it proceeded more rapidly with some names and more slowly for others. It also operated at different times for different surnames, and some surnames were partially replaced with French or Gallicized forms, and other names were completely replaced, and some not at all. So this study investigates when and where Gallicization may have been initiated for three colonial Spanish surnames: Acosta, Caballero, and Placencia. And so to start out with, I'm going to give you a little bit of historical context. So Louisiana was a French colony. It was part of New France, which extended from basically the Hudson Bay down to the Gulf of Mexico. And the French territory in what was now Canada was territory that the British would like to have had, and so they made various incursions, and this all ultimately led to the 7 Years' War between French and Britain and their respective allies in Europe. And this war was fought out not only in Europe, but also in the Americas and in Asia, all the places where these powers had colonies. And so in 1762, in late 1762, in November, France and Spain signed this treaty, which ceded to Spain the territory you can see here in yellow on the map, which was France's Louisiana territory colony, west of the Mississippi River, and including the city of New Orleans. And this cession of this territory was partly to compensate Spain for the loss of Florida during the war. Spain had entered the war late on the side of France and lost several colonies to the British. And in the final peace settlement, Spain had to cede Florida to Britain. So this was partially compensation to Spain for that, but it was also to prevent the British from acquiring all of all of France's Louisiana colony, because Britain did acquire the territory to the east of the Mississippi. So Spain ends up with this new territory in the Americas, which they weren't actually too excited about. It seemed to them like it was going to be a colony that would require more, cost more in terms of support than what it would produce economically. However, they came to see it as a buffer zone between the British territory in North America and their lucrative colony in what's now Mexico. And so about a decade later, we have the American Revolutionary War starting. And although Spain officially was neutral, it did supply covert aid to the British rebels. And so they feared there might be some retaliations, particularly that Britain would attack New Orleans. And if these four cities here, or forts at the time, Natchez, Baton Rouge, Pensacola, and Mobile, were all British forts that would have, quick access, easy access to New Orleans. And so this fear of an attack was not inconsequential. And so the then governor of New Orleans, who had just started, realized that New Orleans defenses were in need of bolstering, and so he asked the Spanish crown to recruit 700 soldiers to add to New Orleans defenses. The crown acceded, and in addition to these recruits being soldiers, when they weren't actively defending the city, they would be expected to engage in some sort of occupation to add to the colony's economy. And the recruits were recruited from the Canary Islands colony, since Spanish authorities thought, the economic situation in the Canary Islands is not that great, and that will help with the recruitment efforts. And so they did recruit 700 soldiers, and they arrived in Louisiana between 1778 and 1783. And the reason why it took 5 years for them to all get to Louisiana is in 1779, war broke out between Spain and Britain. So these fears of attack were actually realized, and the governor then went after these 4 forts and successfully took them. Meanwhile, the Spanish recruits, who were accompanied by their families, numbered between 1,900 and 2,000 when they arrived in New Orleans. And they were settled or divided between 4 different settlements, 2 above New Orleans on the Mississippi River and 2 below. And one of them, Barataria, was abandoned fairly early in 1782. It was the location where it was built was just a few feet above sea level, and there were a couple of devastating hurricanes. And so the inhabitants were allowed to move to St. Bernard, which is southeast of New Orleans. And that's actually the only colony or only settlement of the 4 that actually survived past the colonial period. Galveston, up here above the river, okay, on the east bank, was not in an ideal location either. There were several floods and epidemics, but the Spanish authorities refused permission for them to move. But at the end of the colonial period, the site was abandoned. And then Valenzuela, which is the settlement we're going to be concerned with for this study, its location was better, but still not great. But they were more successful than Galveston across the river. And I chose, or I'm interested in Valenzuela because this is the settlement that would have had the greatest degree of contact with French colonists. So the St. Bernard colony or settlement was located in the swamp, basically, and so it was very isolated. There was not much contact between the inhabitants and the rest of the colony, and even not a whole lot of contact with New Orleans. And then there were also French Acadians, exiled from Canada after the end of the 7 Years' War. And so they came to Louisiana, not knowing yet that Louisiana was going to be Spanish. And so they settled along the Mississippi River near the site of Valenzuela. And then in 1785, a few years after the Canary Islander colonists had arrived and settled, another 1,600 French Acadian exiles arrived in Louisiana, and about half of those were settled near Valenzuela, even in Valenzuela. And so the Canary Islanders in Venezuela were pretty much outnumbered by French speakers. And as points of reference, here we've got a map of the state, and the parish in green is East Baton Rouge, where the capital Baton Rouge is located. And in red, we got Orleans Parish, where New Orleans is. Okay, so again, territory ceded to Spain. The situation after the 7-Year War and British forts near New Orleans, location of the 4 settlements, and the 2 that were abandoned, and Venezuela, the one I'm interested in. And then, okay, now we got capital Baton Rouge and East Baton Rouge Parish in green, New Orleans in red in Orleans Parish. In blue, we've got Ascension Parish, which is where that Venezuela settlement was located. And then southeast or southwest of that, rather, we've got Assumption Parish, which the Venezuela, many of the inhabitants moved south to there. And Venezuela was located on the confluence of the Mississippi and Bayou Lafourche. And so as time went on, the colonists, or now ex-colonists, would build houses, farmland along the Bayou Lafourche, which exits here in Lafourche Parish into the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so this present study builds on my 2020 study of 3 surnames, one of which is different from the surname we're looking at today, but populated the same settlement. And those surnames were Caballero, Hidalgo, and Plasencia. And Caballero was mostly Gallicized with variants of the French cognate Cavalier, although a few families still preserve a Hispanicized variant of the name Caballero. Hidalgo was not Gallicized at all, probably due to the fact that there's no cognate in French for Hidalgo. And then Plasencia was entirely Gallicized by French, with the exception of a few cases of Anglicization. So since Hidalgo is not Gallicized at all, I'm using Acosta instead of that, which largely resisted Gallicization, although there's a few cases where there are families that have a Gallicized surname. And in looking at this study, I also was wondering, what motives are there for Gallicization? And obviously, assimilation to the predominant French culture is the most likely reason, but why exactly they wanted to assimilate is still not clear. And so Holloway suggests intermarriage, suggesting that, because at the end of the colonial period, there were not going to be any more Spanish colonists coming. And one of his informants made the observation that, there weren't enough Spanish girls to go around, so the guys had to marry French girls. However, intermarriage doesn't necessarily require Gallicization of the name. And so that might be a reason, but it's probably not a very important reason, or not a predominant reason. Disguising their Spanish ancestry is another possibility, where it's disguising in terms of Gallicizing their surname so they didn't appear to have Spanish ancestry. And that's possibly due to various negative stereotypes that existed starting in the 19th century after the Louisiana Purchase, because many of the Spanish colonists that had lived along the Bayou Lafourche sold their land to wealthy French and American entrepreneurs that wanted to establish plantations. And they took that money and bought some land in the swamps, which are beyond, the direct area of the river. And these areas in the swamp, the ridges of land, are called brûlés. They're brûlis. And that's because they had the custom of burning off the vegetation so they could clear the land in order to plant a crop. And so these inhabitants of these brûlis resisted assimilating as much as possible. And so as a result, they were basically subsistence farmers and impoverished and poorly educated if they have any education at all. And so these negative stereotypes developed about them, and these stereotypes extended to the descendants of Spanish colonists in general. And also starting in the mid-19th century and going into the first part of the 20th century, we have the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, and Mexican Revolution, all of which generated negative attitudes towards Spain and Mexico and Spaniards and Mexicans. And so Gallicization may have helped avoid consequences of that or of the negative stereotypes. So Gallicization is not required for assimilation, but may have helped avoid stereotyping and social climbing as well. So my hypothesis for the study was that Ascension and Assumption parishes, where Ascension where the Valenzuela settlement was located, and Assumption southwest of that, those two should have the greatest degree of association with Gallicization, since they were the core areas of the colonial and post-colonial contact, and with the Acadian French speakers, and also the origins of the negative stereotyping of the brûlés, which are located in these parishes. And so using the US federal censuses and recruitment and draft records for World War I and II, I collected tokens for each of the three surnames and categorized those as Hispanicized or Gallicized based on their orthography. Basically, did it look like they were trying to write a name that was Spanish or a name that was French? And then also, these were classified by the parish of residence in the decade. And I also collected tokens for vital records at ancestry.com and familysearch.org. But for the state of Louisiana, the coverage in terms of location and time period is very spotty, very erratic. And so also they only go up the data that their database that has the most recent record that year is 1963. So I decided to exclude those from this presentation, although they do support the trend that we see in the census of military records. And I also have made an attempt to collect surname data from historical newspapers in the region. But apparently in the 19th century and the early 20th century, you either needed to be a politician or a prominent member of society to get your name in the paper, including obituaries, or have committed some sort of crime. Even then, that was not, they might just describe you rather than give your name. So, so the data is not as robust as I would have liked. So looking at the findings, so this, on the left we have the military records, on the right census data, and we can see for Acosta, the Spanish or Hispanicized forms predominate from 1860 onwards. And so, as I said, it's Gallicized to some extent, but not a whole lot. And most descendants of the Acosta residents of Venezuela use Hispanicized form of the name. And looking at which parishes are associated with this, we can see that Assumption, Orleans, East Baton Rouge, and Iberville, and Iberville is south of East Baton Rouge Parish and to the west of Ascension. Those are where we have the greatest association between Hispanicized forms and or Hispanicized forms in the parishes. And also, it's interesting to note that in Assumption and Orleans Parish, those are the two parishes that have the greatest number of tokens for Gallicized names, but the Hispanicized tokens far outnumber those Gallicized tokens. And, okay. So, turning to Caballero, its Gallicization in the census is sporadic until we get to the 20th century. And that is probably due, in part, if not completely, due to the small numbers of households that had the Caballero or Cavalier surname. And we can see, though, that in the 20th century, the Gallicized forms take off. They're quickly become the most prominent by 1940, although in 1930 there was some like a surge in Hispanicized variants, but by 1940 the Gallicized forms are the most dominant. And we see that reflected too in World War II, where Gallicized forms are the most predominant. And in World War I, we've got slightly more Hispanicized forms and Gallicized forms, but not a big difference. And looking at the parishes associated with the different names, types, here we see that in Assumption Parish, there is an association with Gallicized forms, that Assumption Parish is where the most tokens occur. And so it does seem like appear that Gallicization of Caballero was centered in Assumption Parish. So that does go with my hypothesis that SOC is about the only name that this is true for. And in places like New Orleans, where there is a good number of Gallicized forms, this is prior, post 1900. So, and then our third name, Plasencia, which was completely replaced by the start of the 20th century, apart from one death record in 1924, where the woman's surname was a Hispanicized form, which I think suggests that Hispanicized forms were probably still being used to some extent, but generally not for official purposes. And in terms of the association of the parish, we see that Lafourche Parish, which is to the south, is where we have the greatest concentration of Gallicized forms. And then, interestingly, these other three parishes that also have a fair number of Gallicized forms are from the 20th century tokens. And then in Assumption Parish, again, our center, actually we do see more Hispanicized forms than Gallicized, but the numbers are small. And so, contrary to my hypothesis, Assumption and Ascension parishes aren't really associated for the most part with greater Gallicization or greater frequency Gallicization. This is true for Caballero, but really not for the others. Somewhat not for Acosta, but again, the Hispanicized forms far outnumber the Gallicized ones. And so, because of this lack of a more robust set of data and less so-called quote official unquote records that might reveal a more fine-grained aspect of this Gallicization process, this all hampers drawing more specific conclusions. other than, okay, this is where it happened, it's over this time period, but not more specific. So, that's it. So thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And we have a minute for a question if somebody has something that they'd like to bring up. Comment, question, raise your hand or type something into chat. Richard, I'll bet you were gratified by the end of your story after looking at this historically over so many generations to have found your hypothesis confirmed.
Well, actually, it did. It was confirmed for Caballero, but not for the other two names. So.
Well, and Hidalgo, as you said, wouldn't be helpful at all. The specificity of your geography and the particular parishes I found interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you.
And good luck as you continue your research.
Thank you.
Anybody from chat or a comment? Cleve has a question.
I was wondering if you've seen any move from the Gallicization, especially with the Plaisance, to further Anglicization, or have anybody moved toward pleasant in the 20th century?
Not well in the early 20th century. In the 19th century, there were some sporadic ones. And then as we move into the 20th century, in the early 20th century, they become more systematic, although still few in number. And I didn't include information from other states, but there were several of these descendants of the colonists that went to Texas. And even in Western Louisiana, those are all practically all pleasant or something similar like that. And those didn't seem to, for the most part, go through a Gallicized form. A lot of them seem to go directly to an Anglicized form.
Sort of leapfrogged there.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Richard. It was very interesting.